Hello, everyone. Welcome again to another episode of Undefined. I'm your host, Ben Maiangwa, and it's quite a rare opportunity to have our special guest today, Dr. Chigbo, author Anyaduba, who has been a strong pillar, a mentor, and like we say, a giant upon whose shoulder so many people have been standing. So it's quite great to have you here, Dr. Anyaduba. And I would like to invite you to introduce yourself to get us going.
I thought you already just did that.
I know, but it's just
Well, thanks. I'm glad to be part of this and to chat with you. As you said, Chigbo Arthur Anyaduba. I'm a professor at the University of Winnipeg, where I teach African literatures, among other things. But essentially African literatures, cultural studies, as well as post-colonial literatures and genocide literatures. I got my PhD a couple of years ago. That should be 2018, 2019, at the University of Manitoba. I'm also in Winnipeg. Before then, I did my master's at Obafemi Awolowo University in Nigeria, as well as my bachelor's degree at the same university in Nigeria, both in literature. So
wow.
Being a literary studies person since I remember. So
You've been a faithful disciple of the discipline.
It's not being disciple of the discipline. It's just the only kind of stuff I can do. If I had my way, I would be a business person probably, or be in tech or a medical doctor.
A medical doctor.
Exactly. But some of us didn't get the opportunity, so we decided to read and write and interpret our stories. So that's how we feed ourselves.
So let's go back to if you had your way. What really stirred the interest in literature and maybe specifically cultural and genocide studies?
That's a complicated one. I think growing up, I grew up in Eastern Nigeria, and yeah, it was interesting in many ways. But if you know the history of Nigeria and the history of the Igbo, you understand what I'm talking about. But growing up in the eastern part of Nigeria, you wouldn't know the history you're actually interacting with until much later in your life. So I grew up as a child. I actually wanted to be a medical doctor, really. That was the hope my mom had for me, and they felt I had the demeanor of a medical doctor. My middle name, Arthur, is the name of the doctor who delivered me.
Oh.
So I was named after him because he did this. He operated on my mom. I was delivered through CS, and my mom didn't have the cash, to pay the hospital, and the man did it for free. So that was why they gave him my name. So the expectation was, at the very beginning, this was, I grew up with that sense that I was going to be a doctor. But then life happened, to study sciences in the East then, at least in Anambra State where I studied, was a huge deal. And we didn't have the funds for me to take science classes. So I had to essentially switch to the arts. The arts was understood as people who are not really serious, folks who were not that brilliant, and because they couldn't learn physics and chemistry, and biology was actually my best subject in secondary school, senior secondary school. So I more or less switched to the arts, and then discovered that I actually loved English, and literature, but we didn't have literature teachers. So essentially I was just there because I couldn't get into the sciences. So my next best option was to study law.
Okay.
So that was what I had in mind by the time I finished secondary school. But then I discovered poetry, I discovered literature, discovered Chinua Achebe's writings, and those things were fascinating to me. And I felt actually, I didn't want to study law. I was doing more philosophical engagements, arguing with priests, with philosophers, actually visiting them to ask questions that provoked my mind, reading different kinds of literatures. So it felt like the thing for me. So I deceived my mom and told her I was going to apply for, JAMB, that my first choice was law. But I put English as first choice and law as second choice, which you understand is ridiculous because nobody was going to admit you with law as your second choice, right? Yeah. So that was the short of how I got myself into literary studies. Okay. But in terms of my study of genocide and my interest in Biafra, it came much later on during my master's program. I was beginning to get more interested. It was more of an indirect thing. I had read a couple of things, heard stories here and there. Read actually Adichie's Half of a Yellow Sun, the time it came out in 2006, but I read it, I think, 2007. We even interacted with her because my professor then invited her to our university, and we chatted with her and all that. But things still didn't, come together for me to want to be interested in that. So my bachelor's, longest year, I wasn't interested. I didn't do anything related to that, but still connected to histories of violence, right? My master's degree was more on historical fiction, but again, dealing with colonial histories and, slavery and all that. But in 2012, when Chinua Achebe published his last work, the memoir, There Was a Country, I was at Obafemi Awolowo University then, and Obafemi Awolowo University named after Chief Obafemi Awolowo, and so the very heart of a lot of things. Many of the folks there are core, diehard, pro-Yoruba folks, but so many of the things I experienced, the racism and ethnic discriminations that didn't settle fully, began to make more sense. Then so I thought, yeah, and I was reading about the Rwandan genocide around the same time. So all those things came together, and I felt actually this is something I want to explore more for my PhD. So that was what inspired the interest, apart from some of the other kinds of stories that could force you to make certain decisions to leave the country. So
right, we'll come to leaving the country in a moment. Yeah, quite a profound background. As you are talking, to a certain degree, I felt you are also sharing my story. Not in any way comparing myself to you.
No, I know you have stronger, better stories, because the North is where crazy things happen. And so many histories connect there, unlike some parts of where I grew up. But I'm kidding.
Yeah, and specifically like going back to, wanting to be a lawyer and taking keen interest on literature, and which was also my thing. But I never thought that I could actually, study literature. Well, partly because I knew my trajectory at the time. But that's a story for another day. Is it also partly why you don't speak Pidgin at all? I realize in conversation with you, you hardly break into Pidgin English. However hard I try to get you to speak Pidgin.
But I try sometimes to interject, in Pidgin and all that. But you're right. I don't generally speak. I think it's a thing with me and languages, right? That's interesting. I studied something connected to languages, not necessarily linguistics, but I'm not that good mastering different languages. Even when I find them fascinating and I hear them, I listen to them. My memory seems to be interested much more in the readings and some other things than in memorizing the codes of language. I don't know why. It could also be related to my mom was an elementary school teacher.
Wow.
So a lot of my early interest in English came from her indirectly, because then she was doing lessons for kids of rich families, and because we didn't have places to go, we would just stay there and be listening in. So she would give us dictations in English, and when I did terrible things, she would force me to write letters of apology because I couldn't articulate myself or express remorse clearly. So writing letters became my way of communicating difficult experiences. And so those were, I think, the things that probably led to that. Then my secondary school was a boarding school, missionary, previously missionary boarding school. The time I was there, it was partly mission, partly government, but still run as a proper mission school where to speak Igbo language was to be considered backward and use vernacular and be punished, actually. I remember a horrible experience where a senior flogged me. There was this belt that was reigning in the late 90s in the East called Chicago Bull. So it has this Chicago Bull design on the belt. And the senior flogged me with the belt, and the CHI on the Chicago came out on my back. And a friend called my attention to it. So I ran immediately, impulsively to the principal's office. Now, the principal was this British trained guy who was speaking proper Queen's English, according to him. But it didn't occur to me that I didn't have strong English enough to report what had happened to me until I got to the front of his office. And then realized, so how was I going to report what had happened? And just then this man came out, said, young man, what can I do for you? And I opened my mouth and closed it. and he figured out I couldn't articulate my thoughts very well. Not just that I lost the case, he gave me more than 24 strokes for daring to be in his office. So not only did I get doubly punished for but that so some of my
was that the metanoia? You decided, look, at this point I had to be fair.
I revolted against English, but still didn't pick Pidgin. It was more of Igbo language, much more for me then. And then at the university, it became English much more. I couldn't learn Yoruba because the few attempts I had turned out to be really bad. You know, they were teaching me vulgar stuff and I was saying it, especially to women, only to realize when one of them called me and actually explained what I was saying. So each time I wanted to talk, those thoughts came into my mind and I just said, to hell, I will just speak what I want.
Okay.
But I pick a couple of things. I love Pidgin because Pidgin English is the popular language of Nigeria anyway.
Right. Well, thanks for that history.
And I write Pidgin too in some of my works.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. We need to start reading your Pidgin writings. All right. So let's fast forward to your PhD in genocide studies. I believe you did your PhD. You mentioned Rwanda, but also Biafra. These were special themes in your dissertation. And now you are a professor of English literature, and you also teach genocide studies. Now, as a peace scholar myself, and conflict, I dare mention, it's not all about peace. We also have to engage in the conflict, and which was how we actually met, right? I think the person who introduced us, felt that you coming from genocide and myself from peace studies, we may have something to talk about.
Yeah.
And the person was right. We're still here, almost 80 years since that day. Okay, as peace and conflict person myself, I sometimes really struggle to explore violent conflict, genocide, war crimes with students in the classroom, but also in everyday conversations, particularly with people whose experiences have not in any way disposed them to those issues, right? Mm-hmm. And so sometimes I wonder, how do I really teach these things? How do I break it down for these people to get into the quotidian lives of those experiencing these issues in various parts of the world, and particularly in these very moments we could look at Ukraine, Gaza, Sudan, Nigeria, and so on. So I was just wondering your teaching pedagogy, if something you could share with us. How do you really engage in such difficult, like they often say here, difficult topics, but not as difficult as people undergoing, the struggles back in their various contexts. What is your pedagogy, I guess, is the question I'm trying to ask.
I mean, that question is at the heart of a lot of things for different reasons, but also largely the point about what's the point of teaching these things really, and can some of these experiences be taught, and in what ways? What does it mean, for example, to teach a genocide? What can we learn from that? And when we learn that, what is the use of it? What's the point? So these are endless questions that provoke conversations for me. For me, it's because again, I work essentially from cultural representations, by which I mean the ways that, say, storytelling, music, films, literatures, different kinds of cultural works, photography, and so on, represent atrocities.
Right.
And from that perspective, we understand that the meanings that we come, for example, come into about certain events are produced in representations. So when we say, I used to give this example, the pandemic, COVID pandemic that happened, how did we come into certain ideas about COVID, informing how we responded to that, largely through cultural representations, COVID as this thing spreading and all that, requiring everyone to be shut off from the world so that they wouldn't get infected. It's destructive and deadly, but it's not just because we saw COVID and suddenly realized what COVID was about. For most of us, we didn't even have COVID then. It was largely based on how these events had been reported to us, how different politicians were talking about it, and all that. And we understand again that these kinds of representations, and we can just summarize it to say story, right? Just to keep things simple, that the stories and how these stories are told shape how we make sense of our world. And that they have power. And that because they have power, there are certain human beings who want to control and manipulate narratives and stories in order to align with their interests. So in the COVID case, millions of people were being infected in Asia, and it wasn't a pandemic until Europeans started getting infected and North Americans were getting infected. It became a pandemic even when, in March of 2020, when it was declared a pandemic, you rarely had any single reported case in Africa, right? But it was already a pandemic because Africa wasn't the site of any historical significance for those with power, right? So that's how I approach things. So I'm looking at how stories about certain atrocities are represented, and the implications of those representations. So when we say a genocide had happened in Rwanda, how did we know? How did we come into that consciousness, that meaning of an event as a genocide? And for me, storytelling plays a lot of role in how we come into those meanings. The same with the Biafran case. Of course, we know the controversies of, it's not genocide, it's genocide and all that. They could do all that the political sense and the legal questions. But I'm looking at how people are writing those stories and whether those stories are producing certain meanings about genocide to us and so on. So how do I teach these kinds of things? Again, stories. Stories are not the same as the real life experience, right? I come from a family of survivors of the Biafran atrocities. And I know some of the stories I was told. I know some of the stories I wasn't told that I gleaned from different sources. And so many things I still don't know about what even direct family members experienced, including my so I understand the delicacy and the sensitivity of what it means to deal with some of these kinds of things, the traumatic implications and legacies of ongoing traumatic situations of these kinds of atrocities. So what I try to do is to provoke questions that get us to think deeply in my classrooms. I want my students and I to think together about what it means for people to experience these things. How do we recognize victimhood? Does victimhood mean the person is entirely innocent? Where does the idea of innocent victim come from? If we meet a victim who has committed violence, does that affect how we understand them as victims? Do we now not feel anything for them because they've actually done violence? Where are those ideas coming from, really? That a victim is someone who cannot do violence, right? What of a perpetrator? Who are actually these perpetrators? Are they people we shouldn't feel anything for because we've already seen them as perpetrators? Because many times people we call perpetrators are actually victims of different kinds of horrible situations that actually make it easier for them to become perpetrators. So the complexities involved that allow us to understand the deeper nature of the world we live in and the violent experiences around us, I think the things I'm much more interested in that provoke conversations as against making easy judgments of simplifying. And there are moments when it's necessary to be clear and talk straightforward, especially to power, when you understand how power is trying to deny its complicity in violence. There are also moments to understand the complexity of what is going on and how it's not easy to just make simple judgments. So it's never a settled thing. For me, it's throw it out, find stories that help us think through these kinds of questions and curate that, and then see what students make with those stories. That way, it's a little bit easier because I hide behind those stories to, again, throw in my own perspectives and what I think. But sometimes it could be very difficult. Students read some of those stories because some of these stories could scar you. People had interacted with these stories and committed suicide from depression because they couldn't deal with the horror that they are reading. So it's finding the balance, finding the right kinds of stories that allow for the kinds of conversations I expect, but deeper questions that these stories provoke for us.
Wow. Yeah, as you were speaking, I was reminded of, I'm sure you're familiar with this quotation by Chinua Achebe: "Until the lions have their own historians, the history of the hunt will always glorify the hunter."
The hunter, yeah.
And this book also by, I think it's Mahmoud Mamdani, When Victims Become Perpetrators, right?
Become killers.
Killers, yeah. Going back to the Belgian colonization in Rwanda and then the genocide in 1994. Let's talk about Biafra a little bit, but not in any extensive way here. But I realize, due to your work, but also the Igbo community in Winnipeg, you've actually pushed to represent the Biafran story in the Museum of Human Rights. Do you want to talk to us a little bit about that?
Oh yeah, it wasn't me actually. It was so when the museum opened, I think in 2014, thereabouts, a couple of Igbo elders and folks from the Omuna Igbo cultural group here thought that it would be grave injustice to not have Biafra represented in a museum for human rights, the only kind of museum like that in Canada, if not in North America. And so they approached folks at the museum and asked them to do something like that. So it took several years of their own lobbying and all that to get round to agreeing to do something like that. And Biafra is very significant for different reasons. It's the first televised African war, so to speak. It's not essentially an African war. It was the imperialist kind of a struggle, but that's the general way people understand it. So a lot of the humanitarian discourses that emerged out during that conflict shaped how humanitarian practices subsequently were approached and discussed across the world. Yet Biafra is never part of the conversation. Doctors Without Borders, that very group, developed a lot of its practices. In fact, they came together to form that after Biafra based on the activism during the war. But the different ways in which Africa came to be represented, African victims of different kinds of suffering came to be represented in Western humanitarian works, were actually informed by Biafran kinds of that history, right? Like if you check Google, African victim of war, you see people suffering, malnourished kids and women with flies everywhere and all that kind of stuff. That was the very, that was Biafra, more or less, from the late 60s. But Biafra has never been part of that kind of conversation. So these were some of the things that informed their advocacy to have Biafra there, but as well for that history to be acknowledged. So the museum decided on doing something like that, and then felt again they had to do due diligence, and they needed a scholar who would provide some scholarly perspective that we guide their stuff. So they reached out to me, and I have a relationship with one of the main curators of that. So I worked with them for about a year and it came, yeah. And I learned a lot during that process as well, because of the kinds of considerations that go into how such big institutions tell stories, which might be different from how, say, someone like me or a writer or someone else might tell a story. But the quotation you gave before asking this question is very apt, because clearly, as I mentioned to some of the Igbo elders, that one has to own one's own story. Yeah. And you cannot expect an institution like that to tell your story so well. It has to be you telling the story the best way you understand it, because there's a limit. They have different interests. Canada, for example, played horrible role during that time in not only denying that genocide was happening, but actually diminished the activism, the humanitarian advocacies of Canadian and other groups based on the role its military played in pretending they were observers just to lie and deny that atrocities that happened were not happening. And they still celebrate that. So how will a Museum of Human Rights represent that when officially Canada has not acknowledged its complicity in the atrocities? So those things were sensitive areas that they couldn't go into. They were much more on the, let's just at least the first phase have this. You know how these things go. But yeah, that was sort of the role I played.
I think you just provided a good segue into talking about Canada and its atrocities. I think it's 3 weeks ago or so that I heard about a young man in Winnipeg being gunned down by the police. And this is something we study, police brutality, violence, and specifically brutality against young, unarmed, or even armed, Black African men. What was that about?
It's about the usual story that we've always come to know, right? So I believe you are referring to Afolabi Stephen Opaso's killing by Winnipeg police folks. What we heard basically from all the kinds of reports and information circulating in some social circles that I belong in is mental health crisis, and police called to help, and then they gunned the kid down. I mean, we live in a world where that seems normal, where people rationalize that something that is unjustifiable, right? And it happens all the time. So because it's so pervasive, again, from the perspective of representation, when something is overrepresented in a particular way, it naturalizes that experience. It makes it look okay. So Black folks are being killed regularly. Black kids, you are not surprised to hear that police has shot another Black person, especially a male person. It just looks, oh yeah, it happens all the time. And then the same kinds of discourse. Oh, was he armed? Was it mental health? Did he charge at the police and all that? Come on. That's the world we live in the 21st century, for a world that claims to have developed all the kinds of things, travel out of space and do all the innovative things. And we are still talking about basic decency, basic dignity, respect for the dignity of a human life. A few years ago, I was visiting a friend in Winnipeg at Ulster, and a young Nigerian student had a mental health crisis, and I was the one who called the police. And what they were saying, asking me over the phone was there a weapon involved? Is there violence? And I kept repeating myself, this is health problem. This is a mental health problem. We need an ambulance, right? But that was the question they were asking me. Why were they asking that question? And we had to be actively present during the process because that guy would have been shot, perhaps, right? If we didn't intervene the way we did. So yeah, it's much more. It's beyond like what's the fact of this case, as they're trying to say. It's much more that certain human beings have been overrepresented as violent, as evil, as people we don't care about what happens to them, and it's easy for folks to just shoot them and get away with it. So that's the world we live in. In Nigeria, I never feared, maybe on the highways. On the highways, you meet police or soldiers who are already drunk and annoyed and angry, and sometimes they shoot you when you refuse to give them money. So I consider those ones armed robbers on the highways in Nigeria. But I've never heard of cases where police is invited to someone's house to de-escalate or help out with any situation, and they just go there and shoot the person, right? Even though we understand the so-called corruption and indiscipline of Nigerian police, but that was never something I feared, that the police could come to my house and shoot me.
Right.
But in a so-called first world country with all the advances and whatnot, that is the major thing. So that you are also afraid to call the police to help when they are supposed to, when they are needed. Right? Because you don't know the outcome, and then you live with the guilt of having called the police to help in a situation of crisis. But that's the world we live in, and it keeps happening all the time in the city with the Museum for Human Rights trying to advance itself as the city of and then the media contribute. So many things work together to allow these kinds of things to continue to happen.
Yeah, thanks for shedding light on that. It's quite unfortunate, and our condolences to the family of the young man and to all those who are affected. Everyone should actually be affected by this. The death of every person should certainly.
Yeah, and to imagine that the family probably put resources together. We understand the world we live in. Many of us come to this part of the world not because we love this place, right? It's because of the imperial situation that destroyed our countries and forced us to seek better places to support not just ourselves but also so many folks back home. The family must have spent lots of money, send their son here to study. In the name that Nigeria is unsafe, you had to find a better place where you are safer and then be able to position yourself very well. And this happens, right?
Yeah.
It's unbelievable.
What do you say to, you came here to undertake a study, your PhD in English literature. What would be your advice to every young person also fleeing the kinds of things you are describing happening in Nigeria, further afield, to go study, and particularly in places like this? How should they prepare themselves?
It's to shine your eyes, as we say it in Nigeria, right? Shine your eyes. Don't live under this illusion that this place is a paradise. It's not. Don't have the illusion that there's one green pasture that you are coming here to. It's not. 50% of the decision to migrate to this place is already a psychological manipulation, colonial psychological manipulation, that what is here is better than what is over there, right? There are material aspects of that reality that are true, but not all of it. So keep be aware, be conscious, understand the imperial system that produced the need to leave one's home and come here and settle, where you have to contend with daily forms of racism, contend with a sense of loneliness, depression. Many international students, they are depressed. Right. They are living in a very cold place without strong social connection, without even their biological composition having adjusted to living in this kind of place, unlike someone who was born here. So there's so many things stacked against you. Right. Yet you want to stay because you believe what is back home is really crazy. You don't want to go back there. So it's to understand why. Right. That is why is that? Why is Africa the continent that arguably is the very richest? Why is Africa producing the poorest populations, especially migrant populations? Something is causing that. So it's to keep one's eyes open, keep one's awareness critical to understand what is actually causing all of these kinds of things, but also maintain social connections. Try to not isolate yourself further. My few and little encounter with a couple of international students who try to isolate themselves. So I don't want to associate with all these Africans, all these Nigerians. It never ended well. Many of them got depressed. Many of them suffered mental health. Many of them tried to overdo things when they now stepped out, and they wanted to do all the social thing, and they joined the wrong set of groups, and they're doing things they are not supposed to do to help themselves here. If you're in Nigeria and, for example, you're into different kinds of stuff, maybe substance, you have connection. It's easy to call your family and they come over and take you and help you. If you are here, you don't have that kind of support. And then you have to deal with a system that already stereotypes you and treats you in the way that they believe you should be treated. So yeah, it's to be conscious, be aware, educate one's mind, understand the history one is living through, but also be prepared, build connections. We used to do that when we were students. We tried to gather folks together, do parties, and eat in a very healthy social space, and everyone chats and meet people as well. It's part of that, right? Yeah. And we enjoyed that, so those were some of the best moments of my studentship here. So, and you were very instrumental to that anyway.
We certainly enjoyed that time.
Until life happened. Why would you leave Winnipeg? You were
we can all be there. Thanks for that advice. And for those in Winnipeg and generally in Canada, you want to reach out to him. He's been a great mentor. He's someone that understands the workings of of the environment here, intellectually, humanly. Is quite a great human, and so we thank you for all that you've been doing for our community. Last question before you go. I was just wondering, what are you currently working on?
I'm working on a couple of things. I know there's an aspect of it I said we shouldn't talk about, but I can mention that briefly. But in terms of personal research, I still do my stuff on Biafran representations. I'm focusing much more now on mass starvation. Because mass starvation has not been given due attention in different kinds of scholarship, even when mass starvation is one of the biggest factors of death and casualties of different kinds during wars and all kinds of things. People use hunger as a weapon. And then even after war, Nigeria, for example, is a country governed using hunger. It's hunger our politicians use to govern and flog people into different kinds of obedience. So it's the instrumentality of hunger in war, out of war, and all that. How that hunger is represented, especially the dominant tropes of starving kids and women, women with deflated breasts and babies clutching onto that. So these fill up the cultural space, and I'm interested in how these are represented, what they are doing to how we understand mass starvation and things like that. I'm also exploring on the side with a couple of colleagues, African migration, especially focusing on African migrations to Canada in the 21st century, because again, there's been increased African migrations to this country. So I want to make sense of that. Again, from my literary field, many African writers are here now writing and setting their stories in Canada. In the past, it's difficult to find African stories set in Canada, right? But now you have African subjects writing about their being in Canada, and Canada as this site of African, this destination of African migration. So yeah, I am, and you are part of that project as well. So
wow, thank you, and it's been quite an honor, really, talking to you. Thank you for your deep and insightful insight, really, on all the issues we deliberated on here. I felt as you were talking that, we should just keep going.
So it's been more than 30 minutes.
Yeah, but I would want to spare your energy for another day, so that when I call, you would answer as usual. Thank you so much, and we wish you well with your research as well as your service to your community and to the people around you. Thank you once again.
Thanks a lot. I think all the thanks below should go to you actually for the work you do and for everything you've been doing for all of us anyway. So thanks. It's been nice chatting with you.
You are kind. Thank you. Enjoy the rest of your day. Bye-bye.